She'd traveled 800 miles for a new life, promised a respectable job, a steady salary, and a chance to escape the ghosts of St. Louis. But the first thing Margaret Sullivan smelled when she stepped off that wagon at Fort McKenzie was death. It was a thick, sweet, coppery stench that clung to the Texas air, a smell she knew all too well. And the most terrifying part, in this God-forsaken place, she was supposed to be the doctor. The letter from her brother Thomas had been a godsend, a lifeline, a position as a civilian medical assistant, housing, meals, $30 a month. It was more than a job. It was an escape from the gambling debts that were about to swallow her whole, from a landlord whose greasy smile promised a different kind of payment for her rent. So she'd scraped together her last few dollars and climbed onto a supply wagon heading southwest, dreaming of a clean slate. But the fort on the horizon wasn't the thriving outpost Thomas had described. It was a collection of splintered wood and desperate prayers, surrounded by a stockade fence that looked like it had been chewed on by giants. The American flag hung at half-mast, a limp apology against an endless, indifferent sky. As the heavy gates groaned shut behind her, sealing her in, the reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a fort. It was a tomb waiting for its last occupants. Wounded men lay on crude cots in the open air, their groans a constant, wretched chorus. Women with haunted eyes clutched ragged children, their faces smudged with dirt and fear. Her brother Thomas rushed to greet her. He looked a decade older than the last time she'd seen him, his uniform hanging off a frame made thin by worry. "Maggie," he said, pulling her into a hug that felt more like a man grabbing a piece of driftwood in a flood. "I'm glad you made it. We've had some trouble." Some trouble. That was like calling a hurricane a light breeze. Before she could even ask, a mountain of a man with a grizzled beard and a blood-soaked sling on his left arm stomped towards them. "Lieutenant, is this her? Is this the doctor?" Margaret's blood ran cold. "Doctor?" Thomas had said assistant. "Doc Sullivan," the man said, his voice a gravelly mix of desperation and relief. "Sergeant Major Reynolds, thank the Lord you're here. We've got 7 men down with fever, 3 with arrow wounds going bad, and Private Morrison's been screaming for laudanum since sunup." Every eye in the courtyard turned to her. Hopeful eyes, desperate eyes. They weren't looking at a nurse who knew how to manage fevers and clean wounds. They were looking at a savior, a doctor, a lie her brother had told to get her here. Thomas quickly steered her away. "Sergeant, my sister needs a moment to settle in." He pulled her toward a small, windowless log building. "The medical quarters," he announced, with a pathetic attempt at a flourish. The room was a nightmare. A single wooden table, stained with things she didn't want to identify, served as an operating theater. The medical supplies consisted of a half-empty bottle of whiskey, some rags that might once have been white, and a leather pouch of rusty-looking tools that looked better suited for shoeing a horse than saving a man. This wasn't a clinic. It was a butcher's workshop. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is this? Where's the fort surgeon?" He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the dirt floor, the full weight of his deception finally crushing him. "He was killed, Maggie, 3 weeks ago. A Comanche raid on a supply convoy." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The surgeon was dead. The fort was under siege. And her brother hadn't just exaggerated the job offer. He had invented it. He'd used her, his own sister, as bait to lure a doctor to this dying outpost. Because no real physician would ever be foolish enough to come. "I can't do this," she said, backing away. "Thomas, I'm a nurse. I clean wounds. I comfort the dying. I've never set a bone, never stitched a man's guts back in. These men need a real doctor." "There is no real doctor," he finally snapped, his voice cracking. "The nearest one is in San Antonio, 200 miles away. We're on our own out here, Maggie. Completely on our own." He wasn't just talking about a doctor. She saw it in his eyes, a terror so profound it made her own fear feel small. Fort McKenzie wasn't just an isolated outpost. It had been cut off, abandoned. Before she could process this new horror, the door flew open. 2 soldiers stumbled in, carrying a third between them. He was young, no more than a boy, his face a ghastly shade of gray. His shirt was soaked in fresh, bright red blood. "Doc!" one of the soldiers gasped. "It's Corporal Patterson. His wound from the raid. It's opened up again." They laid him on the filthy table. Margaret stared, frozen. The wound in his side was a deep, puckered hole, oozing a foul-smelling fluid. It was infected, badly. Gangrene was probably already setting in. He was dying, right here, in front of her, and everyone was looking at her, waiting for a miracle she had no idea how to perform. She'd traveled across a continent to escape one kind of prison, only to find herself in another, far deadlier one, a prison where every life depended on a lie, her lie. And as she reached for the whiskey bottle, her hands shaking, she heard it for the first time. A sound that traveled on the wind from far out on the plains. A rhythmic, pulsing sound. Drums. The people who had done this to Corporal Patterson were still out there, watching, waiting. And they knew the fort was bleeding from the inside out. Margaret's mind was a blank, screaming void. But her hands, they remembered. They remembered the long, grueling months of the cholera outbreak in St. Louis. They remembered cleaning the uncleanable, comforting the inconsolable. She took a breath, shoving her panic into a dark corner of her mind. Fake it. Fake it until you make it, or they all die. "Water," she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. "Boil it, now, and bring me the cleanest cloth you can find." The soldiers scrambled to obey, grateful for any command that wasn't "run for your lives." She turned to Patterson, whose teeth were chattering, his skin cold and clammy despite the Texas heat. She ripped his shirt open. The lance wound was worse than she thought. It was deep, and the edges were a sickening black. It smelled of rot. She uncorked the whiskey. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice softer now. Patterson just stared at the ceiling, his eyes wide with pain and terror. He nodded. She poured the liquor directly into the wound. Patterson screamed. It was a raw animal sound that ripped through the small room and out into the courtyard, a sound of pure agony. Margaret flinched but didn't stop. She used a piece of rag to clean away the pus and dead tissue, her stomach churning. This wasn't medicine. This was butchery. But it was all she had. Outside, the drums seemed to answer his scream, a steady, mocking beat. Thump, 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 thump. They were out there, the Comanche, the ghosts her brother had failed to mention, the warriors who had turned this fort into an island of fear in a sea of grass. Once the wound was as clean as she could get it with whiskey and boiled water, she was faced with another problem. How to close it? How to stop the infection? The previous surgeon's medical bag contained a few curved needles and some catgut suture, but her hands had never held such a thing. She thought of the women back in St. Louis, sewing quilts and mending clothes. The principle had to be the same. She threaded the needle, her hands slick with Patterson's blood and whiskey. "Hold him down," she ordered the other soldiers. For the next hour she worked. Every stitch was a prayer. Every knot was a guess. The men holding Patterson down were white-knuckled, their faces pale. She could feel the entire fort holding its breath, listening to the muffled sounds of pain coming from the medical quarters. Her reputation, her very survival, was being stitched into this young man's flesh. When she was done, she wrapped the wound tightly with the cleanest rags she had. She was covered in sweat and blood, exhausted down to her bones. Patterson had mercifully passed out. "Will he live, Doc?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret looked at the boy on the table, at her own bloody, trembling hands. She had no idea. "I've done all I can," she said, the words tasting like ash. "The rest is up to God." The soldier's recovery over the next few days was nothing short of a miracle. The fever broke. The redness around the wound began to fade. He started taking food. The fort began to breathe again. And just like that, Margaret Sullivan, the terrified nurse from St. Louis, became Doc Sullivan, the miracle worker of Fort McKenzie. Her life fell into a grim routine. Mornings were for treating the sick and wounded. Dysentery, malnutrition, infected cuts, broken bones. Each case was a new test of her nerve, forcing her to rely on instinct, common sense, and the scattered, dusty notes left behind by the real Dr. Webb. In the evenings, she worked with a Mexican woman named Martha Rodriguez, whose husband had been killed in a raid. Martha knew herbs and traditional remedies, a knowledge that proved just as valuable as anything Margaret had learned from doctors. Together, they turned the butcher's shop into something resembling a real infirmary. But the fear never went away. It was a constant companion, living in the shadows of the barracks and whispering on the wind. The drums were a nightly occurrence now. The Comanche were always there, just beyond rifle range, a constant, menacing presence. They would harass patrols, steal livestock, send a single well-aimed arrow into the stockade wall just to remind the soldiers they were being watched. The men spoke of their leader in hushed, fearful tones. Grey Wolf. They said he was more spirit than man, that he could ride the wind and talk to animals. They said he had been educated by white men, that he spoke perfect English, which only made him more terrifying. He wasn't just a savage, he was a strategic genius, waging a war of attrition, slowly strangling the life out of Fort Mackenzie. Then one sweltering afternoon, the routine was shattered. Private Daniel Brooks, a young, eager soldier, went out on a routine perimeter patrol, a 2-hour reconnaissance mission well within sight of the fort's walls. He never came back. Captain Harrison, the fort's commander, sent out search parties. They scoured the prairie for 3 days. They found nothing. No body, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the empty Texas landscape had simply opened its jaws and swallowed him whole. Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep through the fort's defenses. A ghost was one thing, a kidnapper was another. On the morning of the 4th day, Brooks's horse trotted back to the fort. It was alone. The animal was unharmed, its reins looped neatly over the saddle horn. It hadn't escaped. It had been sent. Tied to the saddle was a small bundle, wrapped in buckskin. Sergeant Reynolds cut it loose with a knife, his hands unsteady. Inside was Private Brooks' military jacket, folded neatly. On top of it lay a single piece of birch bark. Scrawled on it, in perfect, clear English, was a message. Captain Harrison read it aloud to his officers, his voice grim. "Your soldier is alive. We will discuss his return. 3 days from now. At sunset. Come to Willow Creek." The officers exchanged nervous glances. It was a trap. It had to be. But it was the last line of the message that made the blood drain from Margaret's face. "Come alone," it read, "and bring the woman healer." The message was signed with a single name, a name that had become a curse, a legend, a nightmare. Grey Wolf. He wasn't just watching them. He knew who was inside. He knew about her. And now, for reasons she couldn't possibly imagine, he was calling for her by name. The command tent was thick with cigar smoke and fear. Captain Harrison's officers argued in circles, their voices tight with anxiety. "It's an ambush, plain and simple," one lieutenant insisted. "He'll kill the captain and take the woman." "We can't just abandon Private Brooks," another countered. "What kind of message does that send to the men?" Margaret stood to the side, feeling like a prize pig being discussed before slaughter. Why her? What possible use could a Comanche war chief have for a healer? Unless he had wounded men. It was the only explanation that made any sense. Her brother Thomas was frantic. He pulled her outside, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Maggie, you can't go. It's suicide. I forbid it." "You forbid it?" She shot back, a cold fury rising in her chest. "You have no right to forbid me from doing anything. You're the reason I'm in this hellhole. You lied to me, Thomas, about everything." "I did it to save you. You did it to save yourself," she retorted, though she didn't yet know how true those words really were. "You needed a doctor for this fort, and you didn't care who you had to sacrifice to get one." The truth of her accusation hung between them, ugly and undeniable. She saw the shame in his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a raw, primal fear. He wasn't just scared for her. He was scared of Grey Wolf, personally. It was a strange, unsettling detail that she filed away. She turned and walked back into the command tent, her mind made up. "I'll go," she announced. The arguing stopped. Every man in the room stared at her. "Miss Sullivan," Captain Harrison said, his voice heavy with concern, "I cannot order you into such danger." "You don't have to, Captain," she replied, her voice ringing with a confidence she didn't feel. "Private Brooks's life is on the line, and if there's a chance to open a dialogue, To stop this constant bleeding, we have to take it. What's the alternative? We sit here and wait to starve or die of thirst? We're already in a trap. At least this way, we're walking into it with our eyes open. Her logic was grim, but inescapable. Fort Mackenzie was dying a slow death. Doing nothing was a guaranteed death sentence. A meeting with Grey Wolf, however dangerous, was at least a chance. A flicker of hope in an ocean of despair. The next 3 days were a blur of tense preparation. Margaret packed a medical bag, gathering what little she had: bandages, whiskey, Martha's herbal poultices, and Dr. Webb's surgical tools. If Grey Wolf wanted a healer, she would play the part as convincingly as she could. She and Captain Harrison rode out on the third day, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The endless prairie felt like a living thing, watching them, judging them. Every shadow seemed to hold a warrior. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered threat. They rode with a white flag of truce, a piece of a bedsheet tied to a lance, though Margaret suspected it would offer as much protection as a prayer in a gunfight. Willow Creek was a thin ribbon of green in the vast brown expanse, a place where the world felt ancient and wild. They arrived just before sunset and waited. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of insects and the frantic beating of Margaret's own heart. Was this a fool's errand? Was she about to get herself and the captain killed, all based on a cryptic note from a man who was little more than a ghost story? Then, just as the sun kissed the horizon, painting the clouds in fiery shades of orange and purple, he appeared. He rode out from a stand of cottonwood trees, not with a war party, but alone. The sight of him stole the breath from her lungs. He wasn't the savage monster from the soldiers' stories. He was tall and lean, moving with a fluid grace that made him seem a part of his magnificent pinto horse. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with a strong, intelligent face and eyes that seemed to see right through her. He carried a rifle and a bow, but he held them in a way that suggested readiness, not aggression. This was not a mindless killer. This was a commander, a king in his own domain. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away. "Captain Harrison," he said, and his voice was the most shocking thing of all. It was clear, calm, and unaccented. The English of an educated man. "And you," he continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers, "must be the woman healer my scouts have told me about." Margaret's throat was dry. She could only nod. "I am Grey Wolf," he said, as if introducing himself at a Boston tea party. "And I have a debt to collect." He dismounted, his movements deliberate and confident. Captain Harrison's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his belt. "The debt is not with you, Captain," Grey Wolf said, his eyes never leaving Margaret. "It is with her." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. What was he talking about? What debt? She'd never seen this man before in her life. This had to be a trick, a pretense for the violence that was sure to follow. But then Grey Wolf did something that shattered all her expectations. He didn't issue a threat. He didn't make a demand for supplies or land. He looked her straight in the eye, and his next words changed everything she thought she knew about why she was here. "My scouts have been watching you since the day you arrived, Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice low and serious. "They watched you save Corporal Patterson's life with nothing but whiskey and a sewing needle. They tell me you stopped a cholera plague in a city called St. Louis." He knew. He somehow knew everything. He knew she wasn't a real doctor. He knew about her past. This wasn't a random summons. It was a targeted recruitment. "The debt," he continued, his gaze intense, "is not one of money or revenge. My people are dying, Miss Sullivan. A sickness is sweeping through my camp. A white man's sickness that our medicine men cannot cure. I did not bring you here to be my prisoner. I brought you here to be their healer." He wasn't her enemy. He was her patient. And the ransom for Private Brooks wasn't gold or guns. It was her. The revelation hung in the air, thick and unbelievable. Captain Harrison stared, his mouth agape, struggling to process the shift from a military confrontation to a medical consultation. Margaret felt a dizzying wave of vertigo. For weeks, Grey Wolf had been the faceless demon outside the walls. Now he stood before her, a desperate leader pleading for help. What, what kind of sickness? She managed to ask, her professional instincts slowly pushing through the shock. A fever that burns from the inside out, Grey Wolf described, his voice tight with a pain that was clearly personal. A weakness that turns strong warriors into helpless children. It has already taken 18 of my people. 7 of them were children. The symptoms he described, high fever, severe diarrhea, dehydration, a distinctive rash, were horribly familiar. It wasn't just any sickness, it was typhoid, a disease that spread through contaminated water and filth, a disease that could wipe out an entire community with terrifying speed. Your government promised us supplies in a treaty signed 3 years ago, Grey Wolf continued, his voice hardening with a cold, righteous anger. Blankets, food, and medicines. The medicines never came. The debt your people owe us is not just for a broken promise. It is for the lives that have been lost because of it. The truth was a punch to the gut. The U.S. government had made a promise, failed to keep it, and now Grey Wolf's people were paying the price in blood. His raids on the fort weren't random acts of savagery. They were the desperate, violent acts of a man trying to collect on a debt of life. I can help, Margaret said, the words coming out before she'd fully considered their meaning. But it will take more than just medicine. To stop this, you'll have to change how you live, how you handle water, food, waste. Some of these things may go against your traditions. Grey Wolf studied her, his eyes searching her face. You speak as if you understand that such changes are not easy for a proud people, he said, a note of surprise in his voice. Most whites simply assume their way is better. I'm not saying it's better, she clarified. I'm saying typhoid fever doesn't care about tradition. It only cares about how it can spread. To stop it, we have to be smarter than the disease. A silent understanding passed between them. It wasn't about white medicine versus Comanche medicine. It was about survival versus extinction. I propose an exchange, Grey Wolf said, his gaze unwavering. Private Brooks will be returned to the fort, unharmed. My warriors will cease their attacks. In return, you will come to my camp and lead the fight against this sickness. Absolutely not, Captain Harrison immediately interjected. I cannot allow a civilian, a woman, to go into a hostile camp. Her safety, she will be safer in my camp than she is in your fort, Grey Wolf cut in, his voice laced with iron. In my camp, she will be under my personal protection. She will be an honored guest. In your fort, she waits for my warriors to eventually breach the walls, or for you all to starve. Which is the greater danger? He was right. Margaret knew he was right. The fort was a sinking ship. His camp was a chance to do what she was truly meant to do. Not just to patch up wounds, but to heal a whole community, to save lives that were being needlessly lost. But there was more to it than that. As she looked at this proud, intelligent, desperate man, she felt a strange pull. He wasn't just a leader, he was someone who saw her, not as Doc Sullivan, the miracle worker, or Maggie, the sister who needed saving. He saw her for what she was, a capable, knowledgeable woman who was good in a crisis. He was offering her not just a job, but respect. I will go, she said, looking directly at Grey Wolf. On 2 conditions. First, Private Brooks is returned before I leave. Second, my medical authority must be absolute. If I say water must be boiled, it is boiled. No arguments. Grey Wolf extended his hand. It was a gesture so unexpected, so civilized, that Captain Harrison was momentarily stunned into silence. Margaret took his hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm. It wasn't a handshake between enemies. It was the sealing of a contract, a pact. You have my word, Grey Wolf said. True to his promise, Private Brooks was brought to the creek within the hour. He was thin and shaken, but completely unharmed. They treated me well, sir, he told a stunned Captain Harrison. Gave me food and blankets. Grey Wolf, he just asked questions. About us. About why we were here. The war chief hadn't just taken a hostage. He had conducted an intelligence-gathering mission. As they made the final arrangements, Margaret felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a strange sense of purpose. She was about to walk willingly into the heart of the world she had been taught to fear most. But she wasn't going as a victim. She was going as a professional, a healer, an equal. Thomas, if he knew, would be having a fit. Captain Harrison already looked like he was about to be sick. But as she mounted her horse to follow Grey Wolf into the vast, darkening prairie, she felt a surprising sense of calm. The debt that had brought this warrior to her doorstep was far more complex than she could have imagined. It was a debt of honor, of life, and of justice. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she felt compelled to help him see it paid in full. The journey into the heart of darkness felt strangely like coming home. The ride to the Comanche camp was a journey into another world. Under a blanket of stars so bright they seemed to drip from the sky, Grey Wolf led her through a landscape that was invisible to her, but as familiar to him as the back of his hand. He navigated by the angle of the constellations, the direction of the wind, the scent of the night air. "You speak English very well," she said, breaking a long, comfortable silence. "Where did you learn?" The story he told her chipped away another piece of the savage caricature she'd been fed. He'd been captured by Texas Rangers as a boy. Instead of being killed, he was sold to a rancher, a man who saw not a slave, but a bright, capable mind. This rancher, Samuel Carson, had taught him to read and write, to understand American politics and business. In return, Grey Wolf had taught Carson's family how to survive and thrive on the prairie. "He was a good man," Grey Wolf said, a note of sorrow in his voice. "He believed the future would belong to those who could build bridges, not walls. He is the reason I seek your help, instead of simply taking what is owed to us by force." This was the man the soldiers called a demon, a strategic thinker, a diplomat, a man who understood both sides of a conflict that was tearing the world apart. Margaret was beginning to realize she had stumbled into something far bigger than a simple medical crisis. They arrived at the camp just before dawn. It was nestled in a bend of a river, a sprawling village of over 60 teepees. But the closer they got, the more Margaret could see that the beautiful scene was a facade. A heavy silence hung over the camp, the kind of quiet that speaks of widespread grief. The stench of sickness was unmistakable. Grey Wolf led her to a large teepee at the center of the camp, its sides smudged with smoke. Inside, the scene was devastating. A dozen people lay on buffalo robes, their bodies glistening with feverish sweat. Their moans were a low, constant hum of misery. An old man with a kind, wrinkled face and eyes full of sorrow rose to greet them. This was Running Bear, the tribe's medicine man. "We have tried all our sacred remedies," Running Bear said, his voice raspy with fatigue. "The spirits are deaf to our pleas. 3 more walked the spirit path yesterday. A child, an 8-month-old girl." Margaret's heart ached. She knelt beside a young woman whose breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Her skin was dangerously pale, her lips cracked. She was severely dehydrated. "We have to get fluids into them," Margaret announced, turning to Running Bear and the other healers who had gathered. "Clean water, mixed with a little salt and sugar. It won't cure them, but it will keep them alive long enough for their bodies to fight." This was her first test, not just of medicine, but of diplomacy. She had to introduce a new foreign idea without disrespecting the generations of knowledge represented by Running Bear. To her surprise, the old man was receptive. "Your methods are different," he observed, watching her mix the first batch of rehydration solution. "But your goal is the same as ours, to restore balance. Perhaps a new sickness requires a new kind of balance." Over the next few days, Margaret and Running Bear worked side by side. It was a strange and powerful partnership. She would administer her treatments, and he would follow with prayers and traditional chants. Slowly, miraculously, it began to work. Patients who had been on the verge of death began to stabilize. The color returned to their cheeks. The light came back into their eyes, but Margaret knew it wasn't enough. They were treating the symptoms, not the cause. New people were getting sick every day. She walked the camp, observing, analyzing, and then she found it. The source, the creek that provided the camp with all its drinking water, ran downstream from the area where they disposed of their waste. They were poisoning themselves. That night, she explained it to Grey Wolf. "The sickness lives in the water," she said, drawing a simple diagram in the dirt. "As long as your people drink from the creek, The sickness will continue to spread. You have to move the latrines, and all water for drinking and cooking must be boiled. This was a much harder sell. It was a fundamental change to their way of life, an admission that their own practices were flawed. It implied a criticism that many would not accept. They will say their grandfathers drank from this creek and lived long lives, Grey Wolf warned. They will say you're trying to make us live like white people. Tell them their grandfathers didn't have typhoid, she countered. This is not about culture. It is about an invisible enemy that we must fight with new weapons. Grey Wolf called a council of the tribe's elders. Margaret watched from a distance as he argued, persuaded, and commanded. It was a fierce debate, but in the end, Grey Wolf's authority held. New rules were established. Water would be boiled. Waste would be moved. It was a massive cultural shift, enforced by the will of a leader who was willing to risk his popularity for the survival of his people. Still, there was resistance. Sullen glances, whispered complaints. Margaret was the outsider, the white woman who was forcing strange new ways upon them. She needed more than just Grey Wolf's authority. She needed to win their trust. Her chance came in the form of a small boy. His name was Swift Arrow, and he was Grey Wolf's 8-year-old nephew. He was one of the sickest patients, delirious with fever, his small body racked with convulsions. His mother, Grey Wolf's own sister Bright Moon, had sat beside him for days, her face a mask of stoic grief. Margaret poured all her energy into saving him. She forced the rehydration solution between his cracked lips, a teaspoon at a time. She bathed him in cool water to bring down the fever. She sat with him through the night, whispering words of encouragement he couldn't hear. On the third day, the fever broke. Swift Arrow opened his eyes, and for the first time in a week, they were clear. He looked at his mother and whispered a single word. Food. A collective gasp went through the teepee. Bright Moon let out a sob of pure, unadulterated joy. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. The white medicine woman had pulled the chief's nephew back from the spirit world. That evening, Bright Moon came to Margaret's teepee. She didn't speak, but she laid a beautifully beaded leather pouch at Margaret's feet, a gift of profound gratitude. From that moment on, everything changed. The sullen glances turned into nods of respect. The whispers became requests for advice. Women sought her out to ask about their children. Warriors showed her old, nagging wounds. She was no longer just Grey Wolf's guest. She was one of them. She was their healer. Her life became a tapestry woven from two different worlds. She taught the Comanche women about hygiene and sanitation, and they taught her which roots could soothe a cough, which leaves could numb pain. She learned their language, their stories, their way of seeing the world, and in the quiet evenings, she and Grey Wolf would talk for hours, sharing the stories of their lives, their hopes, their fears. A deep respect grew between them, which soon blossomed into something more. In his presence, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. He was strong but gentle, a fierce warrior, but a wise leader. He didn't see her as someone to be protected, but as a partner, an equal. One night, as they sat watching the moon rise over the plains, he took her hand. "You have healed my people, Margaret Sullivan," he said, his voice soft. "But you have also healed something in me. I thought all your people brought was death and broken promises. You have shown me that some bring life and keep their word." In that moment, under the vast Texas sky, Margaret knew she was no longer a prisoner of Fort McKenzie or a fugitive from St. Louis. She had found the one thing she hadn't even known she was looking for. She was home, but their fragile peace, built on trust and mutual respect, was about to be shattered. Because far to the south, a different kind of white man was riding toward them. A man who didn't believe in bridges, only in walls. A man who didn't believe in treaties, only in total war. A man whose name was a byword for brutality on the frontier. Colonel Marcus Davidson. And he was leading a column of 200 cavalry soldiers with orders to pacify the territory by any means necessary. The world they had so carefully built was directly in his path. The news came on the wind, carried by a scout named War Eagle, who rode his horse into a lather to deliver the warning. 200 soldiers, Grey Wolf. Cavalry. They move with heavy supply wagons and cannons. They are not patrolling. They are invading. A cold dread washed over Margaret. She had heard the name Colonel Davidson before, spoken with fear even by the hardened soldiers at Fort McKenzie. He was an Indian fighter from the old school, a man who believed the only good Comanche was a dead one. He saw negotiation as weakness and treaties as temporary obstacles. His arrival meant the delicate peace between the fort and Grey Wolf's people was about to be ground under the heel of a boot. Grey Wolf's face was grim, but his eyes were clear and focused. He was a commander assessing a new, overwhelming threat. "Davidson won't honor our truce with the fort," he said to Margaret, his voice low. "He won't care that we returned as soldier. He will see a white woman in my camp and use it as an excuse to slaughter every man, woman, and child here." The horrible irony was that her presence, the very symbol of their successful cooperation, had now become the greatest danger to the people she'd come to love. "I have to go back," she said immediately. "If I return to the fort, he'll have no pretext." "It's too late for that," Grey Wolf interrupted. "His scouts will have already seen you. Your return now would look like an escape, proving his narrative that you were a captive. No, we must face this a different way." But as they planned, a complication arose that twisted the situation into a new and terrifying shape. Margaret's brother, Thomas, arrived from the fort under a white flag, escorted by Sergeant Reynolds. He was pale and agitated, and he insisted on speaking to Grey Wolf alone. Margaret watched from a distance as the two men spoke. Her brother's posture, one of desperate pleading, Grey Wolf's one of cold, implacable authority. When Thomas returned to her, he looked like a broken man. "What was that about?" she demanded. Thomas finally crumbled, the weight of all his secrets becoming too much to bear. "The debt," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "The real debt." He confessed everything. His own gambling problems hadn't ended in St. Louis. He owed money to dangerous men at the fort. To pay them, he had been stealing army supplies, food, ammunition, medicine, and selling them on the black market. But he'd been caught, not by the army, but by Grey Wolf's scouts. Grey Wolf had given him a choice: expose him to the army, which would mean a firing squad, or Thomas could work for him. Thomas had become his spy. He was the reason Grey Wolf knew the fort's defenses so well, the reason he knew their supply levels, the reason he knew when their patrols went out. He was a traitor. "He promised he wouldn't attack the fort if I cooperated," Thomas sobbed, "and he wanted a real doctor for his people. The sickness was already starting. I told him about you, about the cholera epidemic. I thought I could solve both problems, get you away from your debts and pay mine to him." Margaret felt sick. Her entire journey, the lie about the job, her presence here, it was all built on her brother's treason and cowardice. He had traded her, his own sister, to save his own skin. The debt Grey Wolf had come to collect at Willow Creek wasn't just the government's broken treaty. It was his personal leverage over her brother. But before she could even process the depth of this betrayal, a new crisis erupted. Bright Moon ran from her teepee, her face a mask of terror, carrying Swift Arrow in her arms. The boy was burning with fever again. "It's a new sickness," she cried, "not the other one. He cannot eat, and these strange marks." Margaret examined the boy. Her heart sank. It wasn't typhoid, it was scarlet fever, a bacterial infection that was often fatal in children, especially those already weakened by a previous illness. "I don't have the medicine for this," she said, her voice tight with panic. "The treatment is sulfonamides, a new drug. The fort doesn't have it. It's a military supply." A military supply. The words hung in the air. There was only one place within 100 miles that would have that medicine: Colonel Davidson's cavalry column. The situation was now a Gordian knot of impossible choices. The man who was coming to destroy them held the only key to saving the life of their chief's nephew. To ask for his help would be to reveal their location and their captive, inviting an attack. To do nothing meant Swift Arrow would die. "There is only one way," Grey Wolf said, his eyes locking with Margaret's. His plan was audacious, insane, and their only possible hope. It was a gamble that would risk everything on the slim chance that their enemy might possess a shred of humanity. "You are his greatest weakness and our greatest strength," Grey Wolf explained. "He expects to find a captive. He expects to fight warriors. He does not expect to be met on the open prairie by an eloquent, educated white woman traveling under her own free will to request a humanitarian medical exchange. He was proposing they ride out to meet Davidson, not to fight, not to surrender, but to negotiate. They would use her as living proof that peaceful coexistence was possible. They would offer Grey Wolf's knowledge of the territory, his services as a scout, his guarantee of peace from the Comanche, a prize the army desperately wanted, all in exchange for a single dose of medicine. It was a suicide mission. Davidson was just as likely to shoot them on sight as he was to listen. But as Margaret looked at Swift Arrow, his small body struggling for breath, she knew there was no other choice. She was caught between her traitorous brother and the ruthless colonel, with the life of a child and the fate of a people resting squarely on her shoulders. She and Grey Wolf would ride out to meet the devil, armed with nothing but the truth and a desperate hope that it would be enough. The debt had taken one last, brutal twist. To pay it, she might have to sacrifice them all. The pre-dawn light was gray and thin as they rode out to meet Davidson's column. It was just Margaret, Grey Wolf, and his two most trusted warriors, War Eagle and Thundercloud, as witnesses. They carried the same white flag she had carried to Willow Creek. It felt like a lifetime ago. They found the army camped in a wide valley, a sprawling city of canvas and military steel. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. Sentries on horseback spotted them from a mile out. Within minutes, a dozen cavalrymen were thundering towards them, rifles raised, their faces hard and unforgiving. "That's far enough," a sergeant barked, his eyes filled with suspicion and hate as they fell on Grey Wolf. "State your business." This was the moment. Margaret took a deep breath and spurred her horse forward, positioning herself in front of Grey Wolf. "Sergeant," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am a civilian medical professional. I am here under a flag of truce to request an urgent meeting with Colonel Davidson." The sergeant's jaw dropped. He stared at her, then at Grey Wolf, his mind struggling to compute the scene. A white woman, well-dressed and articulate, willingly accompanying the most feared Comanche on the plains. "Ma'am, are you a prisoner?" he stammered. "I am not," she said firmly. "I am a guest of Grey Wolf's people, assisting them with a medical crisis. Now there is a new crisis. A child is dying. We believe your surgeon may have the medicine to save his life. We are here to propose an exchange." The sergeant was so stunned he could only obey. They were escorted into the heart of the camp, through rows of soldiers whose faces were a mixture of shock and hostility. They were led to a large tent where Colonel Marcus Davidson sat behind a field desk, his face a roadmap of harsh campaigns, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He listened to Margaret's story without expression, his fingers steepled under his chin. He had already received reports of a white woman in the Comanche camp and had been preparing a rescue mission, the very pretext he needed to launch his attack. Her story, this insane tale of cooperation, threatened to ruin his entire plan. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice a low growl, "what you are describing is consorting with the enemy, aiding and abetting savages who have murdered countless settlers and soldiers. You claim you are here voluntarily. I find that difficult to believe." "Believe what you will, Colonel," Margaret countered, her temper flaring, "but a child's life is hanging in the balance. We are asking for a simple act of mercy." "Mercy?" Davidson sneered. "The Comanche show no mercy. They understand one thing, overwhelming force." It was hopeless. He was a zealot, a man incapable of seeing them as anything but animals. But as he spoke, a harried-looking officer in a surgeon's coat rushed into the tent. "Colonel, forgive the intrusion," the officer said, his face pale with worry, "but I must report, it's the cattle." Davidson's eyes narrowed. The large herd of cattle they were driving with the column was their food supply for the entire campaign. "Several animals have dropped dead in the last hour," the surgeon, Major Clayton, explained, "and others are showing symptoms I don't like. High fever, bloody discharge. Colonel, I believe it may be anthrax." Margaret's blood ran cold. Anthrax. It was a terrifying disease, a bacterial infection that could pass from livestock to humans with deadly efficiency. An outbreak could cripple Davidson's entire column, killing not just his food supply, but his horses and his men. And in that horrifying moment, Margaret saw their only chance. "Colonel," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence in the tent. "I've seen anthrax before, in the stockyards back east. I know how to contain it." Davidson stared at her, his mind reeling. "You have a choice," she pressed on, her mind racing. "You can treat us as your enemies and watch your command be decimated by a plague, or you can treat us as partners. Your surgeon provides the sulfonamides to save Swift Arrow. In return, I will show you how to quarantine your herd and stop the spread of the anthrax before it destroys you." Grey Wolf stepped forward, seizing the opportunity. "My men know how to handle livestock, sick or healthy, better than any soldier," he said, addressing Davidson as an equal. "We can help you separate the herd. Our knowledge for yours. A fair exchange. A debt for a life." Davidson was trapped. His entire military worldview was being challenged. The savage he came to exterminate was offering him salvation. The woman he thought was a victim held the knowledge that could save his men. To accept their help was to admit that they had value, that they were more than just obstacles to be cleared. To refuse was to condemn his command to a slow, agonizing death from disease. His eyes flickered between Margaret, Grey Wolf, and his frantic surgeon. The silence in the tent was deafening. Outside, a bugle called, a lonely, mournful sound. The fate of everyone in that valley, soldier and warrior, man and woman, adult and child, hung on the decision of this one hard-hearted man. He looked at Margaret, at the fierce intelligence and determination in her eyes. He had come here for a war, but he had just been offered a cure. For a long, agonizing moment, Davidson said nothing. He simply stared, the gears of his rigid, military mind grinding against a reality he refused to accept. Then, with a low growl of frustration, he slammed his fist on the table. "Major Clayton," he snapped, not looking at Margaret or Grey Wolf, "give them the damn medicine. And then you will take Miss Sullivan, and you will do whatever she says to stop this plague in my herd. Is that understood?" "Yes, Colonel," the major said, relief washing over his face. It was a victory, but a fragile one. Davidson hadn't been won over by a plea for humanity. He had been blackmailed by biology. The next few hours were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Major Clayton, a decent and pragmatic man, quickly retrieved the sulfonamides. Margaret prepared a dose and, escorted by Grey Wolf and a squad of nervous soldiers, they rode the agonizing miles back to the Comanche camp. She administered the medicine to Swift Arrow, whose breathing was already shallow, and could only pray it wasn't too late. Then, leaving the boy in Bright Moon's care, she and Grey Wolf returned to Davidson's column. The scene at the cattle herd was grim. Several more animals were dead, their carcasses bloating under the hot Texas sun. Margaret took command, her voice sharp and decisive, cut through the panic. "We need to burn the dead animals immediately. The spores can live in the soil for years. Then we separate the sick from the healthy. Anyone who handles the animals must wash with soap and whiskey. No exceptions." What followed was one of the most surreal scenes the Texas frontier had ever witnessed. On one side of the valley, U.S. cavalry soldiers dug massive fire pits. On the other, Comanche warriors, masters of horsemanship, moved with breathtaking skill, cutting the sick, stumbling cattle from the main herd. Their movements a fluid dance of incredible precision. They worked together, two ancient enemies united against a common, microscopic foe. Soldiers who had been taught to shoot Comanche on sight now found themselves working alongside them, sharing canteens, following their lead. They watched in awe as the warriors calmed the terrified animals, their quiet confidence a stark contrast to the soldiers' loud, clumsy efforts. Prejudices, baked in over generations of bloodshed, began to crack and crumble in the face of shared, urgent work. Margaret was everywhere, directing the quarantine, showing soldiers how to identify early symptoms, creating makeshift decontamination stations. Davidson watched from a distance, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He was getting what he needed, but he was losing something else, the simple black and white certainty of his world. By nightfall, the immediate crisis was contained. The dead were burned, the sick were isolated. Margaret, exhausted and covered in grime, stood with Grey Wolf watching the two camps, one of canvas, one of leather, settle down for the night under the same vast canopy of stars. A cautious quiet had replaced the open hostility. "You have done more today than save a herd of cattle," Grey Wolf said, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "You have shown them that we are not the monsters in their stories." Before she could reply, a rider approached from the Comanche camp. It was War Eagle. He was smiling. "The boy's fever has broken," he announced. "He is asking for his mother." Tears of sheer relief stung Margaret's eyes. Grey Wolf put a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture of shared victory that sent a jolt of warmth through her. Their celebration was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Harrison in a patrol from Fort McKenzie. He had heard of Davidson's arrival and had ridden out to assess the situation, expecting to find a bloodbath. Instead, he found his medical officer presiding over an unprecedented scene of peaceful cooperation. He was speechless. The presence of another officer seemed to finally force Davidson's hand. He summoned Grey Wolf, Margaret, and Harrison to his tent. "You have fulfilled your end of the bargain, Miss Sullivan," Davidson said, his voice stiff and formal. "The anthrax seems to be contained, and I am told the Indian child will live." He paused, looking at Grey Wolf. "Your warriors have proven useful." It was the closest he could come to admitting he was wrong. "This changes things," Captain Harrison interjected, seeing his opening. "Colonel, a permanent peace with Grey Wolf's people is possible. This is the proof." Davidson was silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded. A single, sharp movement. "I will include a full report of this cooperation in my dispatch. I will recommend a formal parley to establish a lasting treaty. But," he added, his cold eyes locking on Grey Wolf, "if there is a single act of hostility, I will return with my entire regiment and wipe your people from the face of the earth." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an offer of friendship. But it was a start. It was a crack in the wall of hatred, a tiny seed of peace planted in the bloody soil of the Texas frontier. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of a sturdy log cabin, built on the neutral ground of Willow Creek. It was both a home and a clinic. Her home. Inside, Martha Rodriguez was helping an Army sergeant's wife with her newborn baby, while Running Bear was grinding herbs to treat a Comanche elder's arthritis. Her brother, Thomas, disgraced but spared the firing squad at Grey Wolf's request, now worked as a clerk, managing the clinic's supplies. A quiet, constant penance for his betrayal. Grey Wolf came and stood beside her, wrapping a strong arm around her waist. She leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Their wedding had been a strange and beautiful affair, a mix of Comanche tradition and Christian rites, attended by soldiers and warriors alike. "Mrs. Grey Wolf," he murmured, his voice soft, "are you happy?" She looked out at the valley. She saw children, Comanche, Mexican, and white, playing a game together by the creek. She saw Captain Harrison sharing a pipe with Thundercloud. She saw a world that everyone had told her was impossible. She had come to Texas to pay a debt, a prisoner of her past. She had found a man who claimed she owed him a debt, and in paying it, she had found her freedom. She had found a love that built bridges instead of burning them. "Yes," she whispered, turning to kiss him. "I'm happy." The debt was paid, not with blood, or with land, or with lives, but with something far more valuable. It was paid with courage, with wisdom, and with a love that had healed not just a people, but a small, fractured piece of the world. If you enjoyed this story, you won't want to miss what we have in store for you next. We've got 2 more incredible tales picked out just for you, right there on your screen. And do us a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell. That way you'll never miss another story from us. We'll see you in the next one.